Well, hey, welcome back. I'm Chris. I'm the pastor at Compass. As always, I am really glad that you're with me today. I don't know if you remember this, but several years ago, we had a global pandemic that basically shut down the whole world. And so our church didn't meet in person for about 11 months. Now, at the time, we only had an audio podcast of our messages. So we had no live stream. We had no videos of our services at all. And when we had to lock things down, I had a crash course in video production and live streaming so that we could continue to meet together online. So we got a camera, we got some lights, got a bunch of new streaming gear, and we set it all up in my living room. This is what that looked like. Now, for a pretty amateur first-time operation, I was pretty happy with this. And I think it made our church look really good, because we were allowed to present an image of ourselves to people the way that we wanted to be seen. But the truth is, it was all really kind of an illusion, because the camera only sees what you want it to see. Now, this looks like my living room is a nice, clean, homey place, and it was within the shot that I lined up. But outside of this camera view, it was a totally different story, because what you can't see are hidden extension cords and cables that were tangled up all over the room. You can't see the desk that's in front of me that's cluttered with papers and streaming gear and coffee cups. And you can't see the couch that's right behind me that has laundry baskets and Bible commentaries stacked all over it. Now, there was stuff even that I missed, like my cluttered desk in the back corner, and it still bothers me that desk is captured forever on the internet. But even that stuff is kind of blurred out by the camera and its depth of field. Our live stream, it looked good because you only saw what I wanted you to see. I presented an illusion of what my living room looked like to the world so that people would think it was clean and classy, when in reality, it was cluttered and chaotic. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, except in people rather than living rooms. Now, in Matthew chapter 23, we find Jesus confronting the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. It's a hypocrisy that develops religious practices that prioritize adherence to the rules over the good of people. And Jesus said this kind of religion, it dishonors God and it leads people away from him. But he continues his condemnation of this type of religion in Matthew 23, verse 25. Check this out. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you're so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you're filthy, full of greed and self-indulgence. You blind Pharisee, first wash the inside of the cup and the dish, and then the outside will become clean too. So Terry and I both drink fiber supplements every day, Metamucil. And we do this every morning because we're getting older and we want to be regular. And if you're over 40, you totally get this. If you're under 40, you will get it someday. But fiber powder gets really sticky when you add it to water, and it can stick to the inside of the cup even after we rinse it out. And the problem is that our dishwasher is a little hit and miss. It's iffy. And sometimes after it runs our cups, they still have a gritty fiber, these bits that are stuck inside there. The cup is fresh out of the dishwasher and it looks clean on the outside, but on the inside, it's still gross. And the hypocritical religion of the Pharisees, it's like an iffy dishwasher. It focuses on making the outside of the cup clean and spotless to present this illusion of purity to the world, even though the inside is still gritty and gross. It's focused on external perception more than it is on internal transformation. And Jesus condemned this perception over purity religion by telling the Pharisees that in spite of their adherence to religious rules, that they were filthy, greedy, and self-indulgent on the inside. They had a great outward appearance, but not inner purity. And this is strong language, but Jesus goes even harder in verse 27. Look at this. He says, "What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but filled on the inside with dead people's bones and all sorts of impurity. Outwardly, you look like righteous people, but inwardly your hearts are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness." We could totally stop here and look at this as just another analogy Jesus used to say basically the same thing he just had. That just because you look clean and beautiful on the outside, it doesn't mean you aren't full of impurity on the inside. But when we have a little bit more background and context, we can see that Jesus is saying so much more than that. That when Jesus says that the Pharisees are like tombs holding dead people's bones, he's saying something really shocking, something insulting and eye-opening even, because having any contact with a dead body was a huge deal according to Jewish law. See, there were a lot of things that a person could do to become ceremonially unclean, but touching a dead body was one of the worst. Look at this in Numbers 19:11. This is the law. It says, all those who touch a dead human body will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. If someone touches a human bone or a grave, that person will be defiled for 7 days. And to remove the defilement, put some of the ashes from the burnt purification offering in a jar and pour fresh water over them. Okay, so if a person touched a dead body, they were ceremonially unclean by default for 7 days. And they had to separate from the community during that time because anyone else they came in contact with would be made unclean themselves. And so then after the 7-day period, they could go through this ritual cleansing and then they could come back into society. And just so you know, this didn't include just touching dead bodies. Touching a tomb, a coffin, or anything else containing the dead, that would also make you unclean. So when Jesus said the Pharisees were tombs filled with dead man's bones, he wasn't just saying that they were only focused on outward appearance. He was saying that in spite of their religious knowledge and their religious adherence, their impurity was so great that their religious practice actually defiled them. Not just that, it defiled every other person it touched. Jesus publicly told the most outwardly holy, righteous, and biblically literate people of his day that they were defiled before God. But there's even more to this purity code. Look at Numbers 19:20. But those who become defiled and do not purify themselves will be cut off from the community, for they have defiled the sanctuary of the Lord. And since the water of purification has not been sprinkled on them, they remain defiled. A person who touched the body, they were defiled for a minimum of 7 days. But they didn't just get to come back after that. They had to undergo a purification ritual first. And whether it had been 7 days, 7 months, or 7 years, until they took the step of being purified, this ritual, they were cut off from the people and they were cut off from God. And Jesus said the Pharisees were filled with dead men's bones, that their practice of religion was full of death and impurity. It defiled them in a way that was ongoing and indefinite. And as long as they practiced it, regardless of how they looked on the outside, that they would remain in an indefinite way filthy and unclean on the inside. Now, the biggest mistake we could make when hearing all this is to start looking for hypocrisy in someone else rather than trying to see it in ourselves. It's so easy to find it in other people, but it's really hard to see in ourselves. In fact, one of the key elements of religious hypocrisy is being judgmental of others while being blind to our own impurity. So how can we know if this is something we struggle with? And when we see it, how do we deal with it? How do we get clean on the inside? Well, I want to give you 3 things that we can do to clean out the inside of our cup if we find grit in there. So let's start by looking at some of the other times that Jesus talked about hypocrisy. Let's look at Matthew 6, verse 2 through 4. It says, when you give to someone in need, don't do as the hypocrites do, blowing trumpets in the synagogues and streets to call attention to their acts of charity. I tell you the truth, they've already received all the reward they will ever get. But when you give to someone in need, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Give your gifts in private, and your Father who sees everything will reward you. Here, Jesus talked about giving to the poor so that he could contrast his followers and how they were supposed to be with the Pharisees. See, the Pharisees, they give in order to present an outward appearance of generosity to the world, while Jesus' followers do it not to get glory, but simply as an act of loving their neighbor. But what's clear out of all of this is that Jesus assumes that giving to those in need is something his followers will do. So the first thing we can do to get clean is to get clean by caring for the poor and oppressed. There's a right way and a wrong way to do this, but doing it is a fundamental part of the Christian life. Look at Luke's account of Jesus' teaching about cleaning the cup. Look at how he writes it in Luke 11:39. Jesus said, "You Pharisees are so careful to clean the outside of the cup and the dish, but inside you are filthy, full of greed and wickedness. Fools! Didn't God make the inside as well as the outside? So, clean the inside by giving gifts to the poor, and you will be clean all over." We can clean what's inside by caring for the poor and oppressed. This is an act of loving our neighbor, and it's one that Jesus assumes his followers will engage in. Now let's look at another contrast Jesus made between his followers and the Pharisees in Matthew 6:5. He says, "When you pray, don't be like the hypocrites who love to pray publicly on street corners and in the synagogues where everyone can see them. I tell you the truth, this is all the reward they will ever get. But when you pray, go away by yourself, shut the door behind you, and pray to your Father in private. Then your Father who sees everything will reward you." And here, again, Jesus shows us that there is a right and wrong way to engage in a spiritual practice. And he also assumes his followers will do it. And it's prayer. And it's also the second thing we can do to develop inner purity. It's this: get clean by praying sincerely. If caring for the poor is loving our neighbor, then sincere prayer is an act of loving God. And this is not the flowery and articulate public prayer that impresses people. Rather, it's the private, intimate, and vulnerable prayer of a person who wants to know God. Prayer is a fundamental spiritual discipline, and it is absolutely essential to having inner purity. But it doesn't require any training or tools. It just requires a genuine and sincere heart as we come before God and as we allow him to clean us up on the inside. So we get clean on the inside by caring for the poor and by praying sincerely. But there's one more thing that we can learn by taking a look here at Luke chapter 7, verse 12. It says, "A funeral procession was coming out as Jesus approached the village gate. A young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. 'Don't cry,' he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. 'Young man,' he said, 'I tell you, get up.' And then the boy sat up and began to talk." If you've been paying attention to this, maybe you can see something Jesus did here that you never really noticed before. He touched the coffin. This may have seemed like an unimportant detail, like why did Luke even need to include this in the story? But knowing now what is in there, we can see that this is actually a huge deal. Because touching a coffin made a person ceremonially unclean, but Jesus did it anyway, and a dead boy was brought to life. Now look at Matthew chapter 9:23. It said, "When Jesus arrived at the official's home, he saw the noisy crowd and he heard the funeral music. 'Get out,' he told them. 'The girl isn't dead, she's only asleep.' But the crowd laughed at him. After the crowd was put outside, however, Jesus went in and took the girl by the hand, and she stood up. A little girl was lying dead in her room, and what did Jesus do? He took her by the hand. He touched her dead body, and when he did, he brought her to life. He didn't have to touch her dead hand and become ceremonially unclean according to the law, just like he didn't have to touch the dead boy's coffin, but he did it anyway. Because Jesus isn't defiled when he touches dead things. Rather, it's the opposite. When Jesus touches dead things, it brings them to life. And when he touches the dead things in our lives, our death doesn't spread to him. His life spreads to us. Which brings us to the third thing we can do to develop inner purity. Get clean by letting Jesus do it. Caring for the poor and praying, those are things we do to get clean on the inside. But this is something God does. It doesn't require our action, only our participation. Caring for the poor is you loving your neighbor, and praying sincerely is you loving God. But letting Jesus make you clean, is God loving you. It's Him reaching into our lives, touching what's died there, and bringing it to life in Him. There's some things only Jesus can clean up. And the beauty is that we don't have to do anything to make it happen except allow Him to. God isn't interested in religion that creates the illusion of righteousness and purity. He doesn't care about how others see us or how we see ourselves if the inside doesn't match the outside, because it's what's on the inside that defiles us. So may our religious practices focus on cleaning the inside of the cup rather than polishing the outside. May our religious practice deal with the death in our lives rather than prettying up the tomb that we present to the world. May we become people who are being transformed on the inside by caring for the poor and oppressed, becoming people of sincere prayer, and allowing Jesus to change us in ways that we can't change ourselves. May we be people who are the same on the outside as we are on the inside. And may we learn to live like Jesus lived, think like He thought, and do what He taught. Thanks for being with me today, and I'll see you next time.